Bruce stood perfectly still, eyes locked on a furious giant rushing forward. Sweat dripped onto hardwood floors as spectators gasped, expecting bones to snap. Nobody anticipated what would follow. One single emotion defied logic, physics, and human expectation. Silence fell. History changed forever inside that humid, cramped Seattle gym. It was late autumn in 1964, inside a drafty, dimly lit gymnasium run by a local boxing promoter named William Bradley. The air was thick with the scent of canvas, stale sweat, and wintergreen liniment. Tonight was not a typical sparring session. It was an open demonstration, a gathering of martial artists from various disciplines across the West Coast. Dozens of men sat cross-legged on the unforgiving hardwood, their crisp, heavily starched white uniforms glowing under the harsh fluorescent lights. They were traditionalists, men who believed in rigid stances, ancient forms, and unquestionable hierarchy. And then there was Bruce. Standing at the front of the room, Bruce Lee weighed no more than 140 pounds. He wasn't wearing a traditional gi. Instead, he wore a simple, dark, short-sleeved shirt and loose-fitting trousers. He moved differently than everyone else in the room, constantly shifting, loose, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet. He looked less like a rigid stone statue and more like a coiled spring. Bruce had been invited by William Bradley to speak about his evolving philosophy of combat, a radical idea that would eventually become Jeet Kune Do. To Bruce, traditional martial arts had become swimming on dry land. He argued that rehearsed routines and robotic movements were useless in the chaotic, violent reality of a street fight. Combat, he explained to the silent room, was alive. It was water. It had to adapt, flow, and crash. You must be formless, shapeless, Bruce said, his voice echoing off the cinder block walls, carrying a sharp, undeniable confidence. When you put water into a cup, it becomes the cup. When you put water into a bottle, it becomes the bottle. You have to adapt to your opponent, not force your opponent to adapt to a 500-year-old stance. Thou. In the third row, a man shifted uncomfortably. His name was Richard Stanton. Richard, known to everyone in the local fighting circuit as Rick, was a mountain of a man. Standing 6'3" and weighing a dense 220 pounds, Rick was a highly decorated black belt in both traditional karate and judo. He had arms like steel cables, a thick neck, and hands calloused from years of punching wooden boards and dragging grown men to the floor. To Rick, Bruce's words were not just disrespectful, they were an absolute insult to the years of blood and discipline he had poured into his traditional training. Beside Rick sat James Harrison and Arthur Pendleton, two fellow black belts who ran a strict, orthodox dojo across town. James leaned over, whispering something into Rick's ear. Rick's jaw tightened. The disrespect was palpable. Here was this skinny 24-year-old kid telling men who had been fighting for decades that their entire life's work was fundamentally flawed. Bruce, incredibly perceptive, caught the whispering out of the corner of his eye. He didn't ignore it. He thrived on the friction. Some of you, Bruce continued, pacing slowly, his eyes now sweeping directly over Rick and his companions, believe that size and rigid power are the ultimate deciding factors. You believe that if a man grabs you, you must use a specific rehearsed counter. But what if the man is twice your size? What if he doesn't grab you the way your instructor taught you? Your form will fail you. Rick had heard enough. With a heavy grunt, Rick stood up. The sudden movement drew the eyes of all 60 men in the room. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. William Bradley, standing near the gym doors, visibly tensed, ready to intervene if things went south. "That's a lot of poetry," Rick boomed, his deep voice slicing through the humid air. He stepped over the seated students, making his way toward the clearing at the center of the room. Water in a cup, swimming on dry land. It sounds real nice, but out here, in the real world, physics matter. Weight matters, leverage matters. You talk about formless fighting, but I guarantee you, if I get my hands on you, all that philosophy won't stop you from hitting the floor. Bruce stopped pacing. He turned to face the giant. A slow, almost imperceptible smile tugged at the corner of Bruce's mouth. He wasn't intimidated. He was intrigued. "Is that so?" Bruce asked, his tone perfectly level. Yes, that's so. Rick shot back, closing the distance until he was standing just 10 feet from Bruce. The size difference was staggering. Rick towered over Bruce, his shoulders twice as broad. I've spent 15 years perfecting throws that have dropped men 70 pounds heavier than you. You think your formless style is going to stop a perfectly executed hip throw? If I grab your jacket, the fight is over. The room was absolutely silent. Even the distant sound of traffic outside seemed to fade away. Men like Arthur Pendleton and David Cole, senior instructors in the audience, leaned forward. They wanted to see the young upstart put in his place. They wanted the traditional ways validated. Bruce didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply raised his hands, palms open, a gesture of calm invitation. I don't wear a jacket, Bruce said smoothly, but you are welcome to grab my shirt. Come, show me your physics. A collective gasp, soft but distinct, rippled through the seated spectators. James Harrison shook his head, muttering under his breath about the arrogance of youth. William Bradley took a step forward from the shadows of the doorway, his hand raised slightly as if to halt the proceedings. Bruce, William warned, his voice tight, this is just a lecture. It's a demonstration, William, Bruce replied without looking away from Rick. And theory is useless without application. Let him apply it. Rick Stanton sneered. He cracked his knuckles, the sound popping like dry twigs in the quiet room. He unfastened the top of his heavy canvas key, adjusting his black belt with a sharp, aggressive tug. He stepped fully onto the designated mat area, his bare feet squeaking against the rubberized surface. You asked for it, kid, Rick growled. Rick's plan was simple and brutally effective. He intended to execute a traditional O-Goshia major hip throw. In his mind, he had mapped out the entire sequence. He would lunge forward, secure a vice-like grip on Bruce's collar and sleeve, step in to drop his hips below Bruce's center of gravity, and launch the smaller man over his back. With an 80-pound weight advantage, Rick knew that once he established his grip, Bruce would be entirely at his mercy. He didn't just want to throw Bruce. He wanted to slam him onto the mat hard enough to rattle his teeth and shatter his modern philosophies. Bruce, conversely, did almost nothing. He didn't drop into a wide, deeply rooted horse stance. He didn't raise his guard to protect his face. He simply stood there, his arms resting loosely by his sides, his knees slightly bent. His breathing was slow and rhythmic. He was the very embodiment of the water he had just spoken about, relaxed, uncontained, waiting for the vessel to shape him. Any time you are ready, Bruce whispered. Rick exploded forward. For a man of his immense size, Rick was startlingly fast. Years of repetitive drilling had ingrained the explosive forward step into his muscle memory. He closed the 10-foot gap in a fraction of a second. His massive right hand shot out like a bear trap, fingers curling violently into the fabric of Bruce's shirt near the collarbone. His left hand clamped down onto Bruce's right wrist. Smack! The sound of flesh and fabric colliding echoed sharply. Rick had his grip. The traditionalists in the crowd mentally cheered. In the rigid world of classical grappling, the fight was essentially over. Gotcha, Rick hissed through his teeth. Rick immediately pivoted, forcefully pulling Bruce forward to break his balance. He drove his right leg deep between Bruce's legs, twisting his massive torso to present his hip. He engaged his core, preparing to hoist the 140-pound martial artist into the air and bring him crashing down onto the unforgiving floor. It was a textbook setup, flawless execution. The leverage was perfect, the momentum was unstoppable. But as Rick flexed his massive legs to lift, nothing happened. It was a terrifying sensation for the giant. It felt as if he had tried to uproot an ancient oak tree with his bare hands. He strained, the veins in his thick neck bulging, his face flushing a deep crimson. He pulled with every ounce of his tremendous strength, attempting to force Bruce's body over his hip. But Bruce wasn't there. Or rather, Bruce was there, but he had entirely neutralized the energy. In the microscopic fraction of a second when Rick had grabbed his shirt and pivoted, Bruce had not resisted the pull. Instead of leaning back and fighting the giant's strength, which would have resulted in an immediate catastrophic throw, Bruce had flowed with it. As Rick pulled, Bruce instantly relaxed his entire body, dropping his center of gravity lower than Rick's and shifting his weight entirely to his lead leg. He didn't stiffen, he melted. Bruce yielded to the aggressive pulling force, allowing his body to travel with Rick's momentum, but subtly changing the angle. Suddenly, Rick found himself pulling dead weight that was spiraling away from his center of balance. Because Bruce had flowed forward instead of resisting, Rick's violent rotational pull caused the big man to over-rotate. Rick's hip missed Bruce's center of gravity completely. Panic flashed in Rick Stanton's eyes. He had the grip, he had the position, but he had absolutely zero leverage. He was standing on one leg, twisted awkwardly, holding onto a man who felt like he was made of liquid mercury. "What the?" Rick grunted, his balance wavering as his own momentum began to betray him. Bruce was still perfectly calm, his face inches from Rick's sweating neck. "You rely on the anchor," Bruce murmured quietly, meant only for Rick to hear. "But what happens when the ship moves?" The crowd, primarily James Harrison and Arthur Pendleton, sat frozen in disbelief. They couldn't process what they were seeing. Rick Stanton, a man who threw heavyweights for sport, was straining until he shook, completely unable to lift a man half his size. Bruce wasn't using strength, he was using pure, undeniable physics against a man who claimed to master it. Rick roared in frustration. Refusing to be humiliated, he decided to abandon the hip throw. He released Bruce's wrist, intending to turn back around and deliver a devastating right cross to Bruce's jaw. But releasing that grip was the fatal mistake. The moment Rick's left hand left Bruce's wrist, the tension snapped. The water that had been yielding suddenly crashed like a tidal wave. Bruce didn't wait for Rick to turn. Before the giant could even plant his foot back on the ground to throw a punch, Bruce initiated his counterattack. It was a movement so fast, so seamlessly integrated into Rick's own failing momentum, that the human eye could barely track the mechanics of it. The room held its breath as Bruce stepped deep into the giant's shadow, his loose posture instantly transforming into kinetic, explosive power. The room held its breath as Bruce stepped deep into the giant's shadow, his loose posture instantly transforming into kinetic, explosive power. For Rick Stanton, time seemed to fracture. In his mind, he was already pivoting back around, his right shoulder dropping to load up a devastating overhand punch. He was a veteran of hundreds of sparring matches. He knew the rhythm of a fight. You miss a throw, you reset. You establish distance and you strike. That was the classical rhythm. It was a waltz of violence governed by unspoken rules of engagement that every man in that room implicitly understood. Bruce Lee, however, did not dance to that rhythm. He did not step back to reset. He did not retreat to a safe distance to evaluate his opponent's new stance. Instead, Bruce violated every fundamental rule of traditional spacing. He stepped in. Before Rick could even plant his left foot to anchor his weight for the punch, Bruce had already bridged the gap. He moved entirely inside Rick's reach, stepping so close that the fabric of their shirts brushed against one another. To the traditionalists watching, this was madness. You didn't crowd a much larger, stronger man. You stayed on the outside where you could see his weapons. But Bruce understood something about the anatomy of a strike that the others had forgotten in their rigid cutters. A punch is only dangerous at the end of its arc. By stepping completely inside the giant's guard, Bruce effectively smothered Rick's offensive weapons before they could even be deployed. Rick's eyes widened in shock as he realized Bruce was occupying the very space he needed to generate power. Desperate, Rick threw the right hook anyway, a wild, unanchored swing fueled by sheer panic and frustration. It was heavy, carrying the weight of a desperate 220-pound man, but it was wildly off balance. Bruce didn't block it. Rocking meant meeting force with force, a contest of strength that Bruce, at a mere 140 pounds, mathematically could not win. Instead, he intercepted it. As Rick's massive arm swung in a looping arc, Bruce's left hand shot out, open-palmed. It wasn't a rigid block. It was a pak sao, a slapping parry drawn from his Wing Chun background. Bruce's palm met the inside of Rick's bicep, just above the elbow. He didn't try to stop the arm. He simply applied a sharp, outward pressure. violently redirecting the trajectory of the giant's punch. Rick's arm flew harmlessly past Bruce's ear, the immense kinetic energy completely wasted on empty air. This redirection pulled Rick's right shoulder forward, dragging his center of gravity even further past his base of support. The giant was now leaning precariously forward, standing on one foot, his momentum hijacked by the smaller man. Rick was structurally defeated, but his brain had not yet registered the catastrophe. Bruce did not hesitate. The sequence that followed occurred in a span of time so minuscule that James Harrison and Arthur Pendleton, sitting in the third row, later argued about what exactly had transpired. Simultaneous to the Paxao parry, Bruce's right foot slid forward, the edge of his canvas shoe hooking sharply behind Rick's planted right heel. It was a subtle, almost invisible trap, severing the giant's last connection to the floor. Then came the strike. Bruce's right fist was resting casually near his own hip. He didn't draw it back. He didn't wind up. He didn't twist his hips into a deep, traditional reverse punch. The strike originated from a distance of perhaps 3 inches from Rick's sternum. It was a perfect, terrifying execution of localized power generation. Bruce's entire body, the snap of his ankle, the torque of his waist, the sudden contraction of his lats, and the forward drive of his shoulder synchronized in a single, devastating micro-explosion. Crack. The sound was not the dull, meaty thud of a standard boxing punch. It was a sharp, concussive crack, like a dry wooden board being snapped over a knee. Rick Stanton felt a localized vibration radiate through his chest cavity. It didn't feel like he had been punched. It felt as though he had been hit by a heavy wooden battering ram swinging from a cathedral ceiling. All the oxygen was violently evicted from his lungs in a sharp, involuntary hiss. Because Bruce's foot was trapped behind his heel, Rick could not step back to absorb the sheer kinetic force of the strike. The physics were absolute and unforgiving. The energy had nowhere to go but directly into the giant's center of mass, violently displacing it. Rick's feet actually left the hardwood floor. For a terrifying fraction of a second, the 220-pound black belt was entirely airborne, his massive frame parallel to the ground. The men in the audience physically recoiled, several of them throwing their hands up as if to catch him. Gravity reclaimed the giant with vicious authority. Rick hit the canvas floor with a catastrophic boom that rattled the fluorescent light fixtures hanging from the ceiling. Dust motes, disturbed by the immense impact, danced crazily in the harsh white light. The impact was so severe that Rick's body actually bounced slightly off the unforgiving mats, a low groan escaping his lips as the wind was entirely knocked out of him. He lay there flat on his back, staring blankly up at the water-stained ceiling tiles. His mind was entirely blank. He wasn't unconscious, but his central nervous system was in a state of absolute system failure. He tried to command his arms to move, to push himself up, but his muscles refused to obey. He was paralyzed by the sheer, unadulterated shock of what had just occurred. Above him, the ceiling lights seemed to hum louder. Bruce Lee stood over the fallen giant. He had not broken a sweat. His breathing remained slow, deep, and perfectly rhythmic. He did not drop into a combative stance to prepare for a follow-up attack. He simply stood there, his arms resting loosely by his sides, a picture of absolute terrifying tranquility. He was the water that had crashed, and now the sea was calm again. The silence inside William Bradley's gymnasium was not just quiet, it was a heavy, suffocating vacuum. 60 highly trained martial artists, men who had spent decades conditioning their knuckles on makiwara boards and memorizing centuries-old forms, sat absolutely motionless. Nobody spoke. Nobody blinked. James Harrison's jaw was visibly unhinged, his eyes darting frantically between the serene, relaxed posture of Bruce Lee and the massive, groaning form of Rick Stanton, spread-eagled on the floor. Beside him, Arthur Pendleton instinctively rubbed his own chest, phantom pain echoing the strike he had just witnessed. David Cole, a staunch traditionalist who had loudly mocked Bruce's theories before the seminar began, was staring at the floorboards, looking as though he had just watched a ghost walk through a solid cinder block wall. The paradigm of their entire universe had just been brutally inverted. A 140-pound man had completely dismantled a 220-pound giant, not through trickery, not through blind luck, but through a terrifying mastery of mechanics that none of them possessed. William Bradley was the first to break the paralysis. He stepped forward from the shadows, clearing his throat loudly. The sound seemed to snap the audience out of their trance. "Ah, are you all right, Rick?" William asked, his voice trembling slightly. On the mat, Rick Stanton let out a long, ragged exhale. He blinked slowly, the harsh ceiling lights finally coming back into focus. He rolled onto his side, grimacing as his bruised back muscles protested. He placed a massive, trembling hand on the mat, attempting to push himself up to a seated position. He felt humiliated, entirely stripped of his pride, but deeper than that, he felt a profound, unsettling confusion. Before Rick could struggle to his knees, a hand appeared in his field of vision. It was a slender hand, the knuckles lightly calloused, extended in a gesture of pure, unmistakable respect. Rick followed the arm up, meeting the dark, intense eyes of Bruce Lee. There was no arrogance in Bruce's gaze. There was no gloating smirk, no triumphant chest-beating. Bruce's expression was calm, analytical, and entirely empathetic. He was looking at Rick not as a vanquished enemy, but as a fellow student of combat who had just learned a hard, necessary lesson. For a long moment, Rick stared at the offered hand. The traditionalist pride within him screamed to swat it away, to get up on his own, to demand a rematch. But the martial artist in him, the man who genuinely sought truth in combat, knew better. He had been outclassed in a way he hadn't thought possible. Swallowing his pride, Rick reached out and grasped Bruce's forearm. Bruce braced his stance and pulled. With surprising, effortless strength, the smaller man hauled the 220-pound giant to his feet. "Thank you," Rick mumbled, his voice thick, rubbing his sternum where the 1-inch punch had landed. He felt a deep, localized ache, but surprisingly nothing was broken. Bruce had possessed the control to demonstrate lethal power without inflicting permanent damage. Bruce nodded respectfully, releasing Rick's arm. He stepped back into the center of the mat and turned to face the silent, stunned audience. He began to pace again, his footsteps silent on the canvas. "What you just witnessed," Bruce began, his voice cutting through the thick silence of the gymnasium, "was not magic. It was not a secret, mystical technique passed down from a mountain temple. It was simple, undeniable physics." He pointed a finger toward the spot where Rick had fallen. "Mr. Stanton is strong. He is powerful. If this were a contest of lifting heavy stones, he would defeat me effortlessly. But a fight is not a contest of lifting stones. A fight is dynamic. It is alive." Bruce stopped pacing and looked directly into the eyes of James Harrison in the third row. When Mr. Stanton grabbed my shirt to execute his hip throw, his mind was already in the future. He had committed to a preconceived sequence of movements. Step 1, grab. Step 2, pull. Step 3, turn the hip. Step 4, throw. His mind was locked into a rigid form. He was swimming on dry land. Bruce raised his open hands, mimicking the movement of water. He expected me to act like a traditional opponent. He expected me to tense up, to resist his pull, to fight his strength with my own strength. If I had done that, he would have found his anchor. He would have used my resistance as a fulcrum to leverage my body over his hip. His classical training relied entirely on my classical reaction. The men in the room leaned forward, hanging on every syllable. The hostility that had filled the room 20 minutes prior had entirely evaporated, replaced by a thirsty, desperate curiosity. "But I did not give him a classical reaction," Bruce continued, dropping his hands. "When he pulled, I did not resist. I yielded. I became water. By flowing with his pulling force, I accelerated his own momentum beyond his control. I removed his anchor. Suddenly, his immense strength became his greatest enemy. He threw himself off balance. Rick Stanton, standing quietly near the edge of the mat, nodded slowly. Hearing it broken down logically, mechanically, made the humiliation sting a little less. He realized he hadn't been beaten by a better technique. He had been beaten by a superior concept. "In your dojos," Bruce said, his voice rising, filling the cavernous space, You train with partners who collude with you. You execute a punch, they block exactly as rehearsed. You step forward, they step back. It is a beautiful dance, but it is a lie. The street does not collude with you. An attacker in an alleyway does not care about your stance. He will not attack you with a perfect chambered lunge punch. Bruce chopped his hand sharply through the air. Combat is chaos. It is fractured, broken rhythm. If you drill yourself into a rigid robot, a slave to a 500-year-old posture, you will shatter when you meet true, unscripted violence. You must strip away the non-essentials. You must stop trying to fit the fight into a neat, traditional box, and instead let the fight dictate your movements. He paused, letting the silence hang heavy in the air, ensuring the weight of his words sank deep into the minds of the classical masters sitting before him. "I tell you again," Bruce said softly, intimately, "empty your mind. Be formless, shapeless. Like water, if you are rigid, you will be broken. If you are fluid, you can adapt to any shape, any opponent, any environment. Do not learn to fight, learn to express the human body in combat." For a long, profound moment, nobody moved. The air in the gymnasium felt completely different. The scent of stale sweat and wintergreen liniment was still there, but the atmosphere of arrogant traditionalism had been washed away, cleansed by a violent, beautiful truth. Slowly, deliberately, a sound began to echo from the back of the room. It was David Cole. The staunch, unwavering traditionalist was bringing his hands together. Clap, clap, clap. Beside him, Arthur Pendleton joined in. Then James Harrison. Within seconds, the entire gymnasium had erupted into applause. Men who had walked into William Bradley's gym an hour ago, ready to laugh a young, arrogant upstart out of the building, were now clapping until their palms burned, acknowledging a martial genius that was generations ahead of his time. Rick Stanton, the giant who had been humiliated, dismantled, and dropped on his back, took a deep breath. He looked at the young man standing in the center of the mat, a man, small in stature but colossal in presence. Rick brought his massive hands together, clapping louder than anyone else in the room. He had lost a fight, but he had found something infinitely more valuable. He had found the truth. Bruce Lee stood amidst the thunderous applause, offering a slight, respectful bow. He had not just defeated a giant that day, he had defeated a mindset. He had planted a seed of revolution in the fertile soil of the West Coast martial arts community. The rigid statues of the past had finally been cracked, and through those fissures the water of Jeet Kune Do was beginning to flow, unstoppable, formless, and brilliantly alive. The world of combat would never, ever be the same. Bruce Lee didn't just fight, he dismantled the very idea of how combat should look. His philosophy of becoming water forever changed martial arts, proving that fluid adaptability always conquers rigid, unyielding strength. If this true story of speed, intellect, and raw power left you completely breathless today, please smash that like button, share this video with your fellow martial arts enthusiasts, and subscribe for more legendary historical deep dives.